The rope burned deeper into her wrists with every shallow breath she took. It was pulled tight between two crooked cottonwood trees, stretched so high that her toes barely brushed the dust. The sun hung low and cruel, staining the western sky with blood-red light, and the wind whispered through the dry grass like it was already mourning her. Her name was Clara May Holloway, and at 23 years old, she was about to die alone on the edge of the Wyoming plains, condemned without a trial, abandoned without mercy. They had tied her there at dawn. 3 men from the settlement she once called home. Men who had eaten at her table, who had tipped their hats when she passed, who now would not meet her eyes. They said she was cursed. They said wherever she went, death followed. First her father, crushed under a wagon wheel. Then her husband, dead from a fever only weeks after their wedding. In the West, grief made people fearful, and fear made them cruel. It was easier to call her a witch than to admit life was unfair. When she begged, they told her God would judge her better than they could. Then they rode away. By midday, the pain had become a distant echo, replaced by dizziness and the strange calm that comes when the body begins to surrender. Her head slumped forward. Her hair, once neatly braided, now clung to her face with sweat and dust. She whispered prayers she barely believed in anymore, not to be saved, just for the pain to end. That was when the sound reached her ears, hoofbeats, slow, steady, real. At first she thought it was death itself, come riding at last. But the sound grew closer, and then a shadow crossed the ground beneath her feet. A horse snorted. Leather creaked. Someone dismounted. A man stood before her, tall and broad-shouldered, his hat pulled low, his coat dusted with miles of travel. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, sharp but not unkind. He took in the scene in silence, jaw tightening as he followed the rope from her wrists to the trees. "What the hell did you do to deserve this?" he asked. Not to accuse her, but the world. She tried to speak. Only a rasp came out. That was enough. The cowboy moved fast, knife flashing in the sun. The rope snapped free, and her body collapsed into his arms like she weighed nothing at all. He held her carefully, as if afraid she might shatter, and lowered her to the ground. He poured water between her cracked lips, supporting her head while she drank. "My name's Eli Mercer," he said quietly. "You're safe now." She laughed weakly at that. Safe was a word she no longer trusted. Eli was a widowed rancher, known up and down the plains as a hard man who kept to himself. He had buried his wife 2 winters back, along with the part of him that believed in easy happiness. He wasn't looking for trouble that day. He was riding to check fence lines. But the West had a way of placing broken souls in each other's paths. He lifted Clara onto his horse and rode until the sun dipped below the horizon. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand explanations. He simply rode, stopping only when the lights of his remote ranch house appeared like a promise. Against the dark, for days, Clara drifted in and out of fever. Eli sat beside her bed through the nights, changing cloths, forcing broth past her lips, listening to her cry out in terror as memories dragged her back to those trees. He never touched her unless necessary, never spoke louder than a murmur. When she finally woke fully, the first thing she saw was him asleep in the chair, head tipped forward, hands rough and scarred from a life of work. She cried then quietly, not from pain, but from the shock of kindness. She expected questions, accusations, judgment. Instead, Eli simply said, "You can stay as long as you need." Out on the plains, rumors traveled faster than horses. Before the week was out, people knew Eli Mercer had taken in the woman who'd been left for dead. They warned him she was cursed, that she'd bring ruin to his land, his cattle, his life. Eli listened, then he closed his gate. Clara healed slowly. Her body recovered faster than her spirit. She startled at raised voices. He flinched at sudden movements and woke screaming some nights. Eli never mocked her weakness. He never tried to fix her pain with empty words. He gave her space, and when she asked, he gave her purpose. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, feeding chickens, mending clothes, cooking meals that tasted like something worth staying alive for. Slowly, the silence between them grew comfortable. Neither of them spoke of love. Both of them felt it taking root anyway. But the past, like the West itself, was not something that stayed buried. The men who had tied Clara between those trees did not forget her. When the drought came and cattle started dying, they whispered her name again. When a child fell ill, they said it was her curse spreading. Fear needed a face, and Clara's was easy to remember. One evening, as the sun bled across the land, Eli saw riders approaching his fence line, 5 of them armed. Clara knew before he told her. She had learned to read tension the way some people read books. She packed a small bag that night, hands shaking, heart heavy with resignation. She had never meant to bring trouble to him. Eli stopped her at the door. "They don't get to decide your fate," he said. "They already did once," she replied softly. This time he stood in front of her. When the men demanded she be handed over, Eli refused. Words turned to threats. Threats turned to gunfire. The West did not care about fairness, only about who stood their ground. The fight was fast and brutal. When it ended, 2 men lay wounded, and the rest rode away, beaten and ashamed. Eli was bleeding from a graze to the shoulder. Clara tore her dress to bind him, hands steady despite her fear. That night, something changed between them. Clara realized she was not cursed. She was simply human, living in a world that often punished women for surviving. Eli realized that saving her had not ruined his life. It had given it back meaning. In time, they married quietly. No grand ceremony, just vows spoken under the open sky. Clara still carried scars, both seen and unseen. Eli still carried grief. But together they learned that love did not require perfection, only courage. Years later, when travelers passed by the ranch and asked about the 2 old cottonwood trees standing far off in the distance, Clara would look out across the land and smile. "That's where my life almost ended," she would say, "and where it truly began." The seasons did not soften the land, but they softened the people who worked it. After the gunfire and the warning sent riding back to town, Eli's ranch became a quiet defiance against cruelty. No one said Clara's name aloud anymore, not with accusation. They said it with uncertainty. The way people speak of something that has survived when it was not meant to. She learned that survival itself unsettles those who profit from fear. Marriage did not erase her nightmares. Some nights she still woke with her wrists burning, convinced the rope had returned. When that happened, Eli never spoke. He would sit up, grounding her with his presence, his hand resting near hers, but never gripping, always letting her choose closeness. In that patience, she healed more than she ever had with time alone. Life on the ranch was honest and unforgiving. Drought returned, storms ripped across the plains, and cattle were lost despite all effort. But Clara worked beside Eli, not behind him. She learned to ride hard, to shoot straight, to negotiate with traders who underestimated her because of her quiet voice and steady gaze. Slowly, people noticed something unsettling. Wherever Clara stood, things did not rot. They endured. The town changed its stories. They said she had bewitched Eli into prosperity. They said the ranch survived because she had paid some dark price. But none of them rode out to see the truth. That the land thrived because 2 broken people worked it together without cruelty. One winter, sickness swept through the settlement. Children burned with fever. Men who had once tied ropes now knelt beside beds, powerless. It was Clara who rode in with poultices and knowledge, learned from her mother long before the wagon accident. She did not refuse them. She did not remind them of the trees. She tended the sick with steady hands and a face free of judgment. When the last child recovered, the town held its breath. No curse followed. No punishment came. Only quiet shame. An old woman approached Clara one evening, her back bent with years of regret. She had watched silently when the men tied the rope. Her apology was small, trembling, imperfect. Clara accepted it anyway. Forgiveness did not erase the past, but it loosened its grip. Years passed. The cottonwood trees still stood, twisted by wind, their bark scarred where the rope once cut deep. Clara never asked Eli to cut them down. She rode past them sometimes not as a victim, but as a woman who had walked through death and returned carrying something stronger than bitterness. When Eli grew older and his hands stiffened with age, Clara took on more of the ranch work. When her strength faltered in turn, Eli slowed his pace to match hers. Love did not arrive in grand gestures. It lived in shared silence, in meals eaten after long days, in the simple certainty that neither would ever abandon the other to fear again. Toward the end of their lives, travelers sometimes asked how two people so quiet had built something that lasted in a land that devoured the weak. Eli would glance at Clara before answering, always. She survived what should have killed her, he'd say, and I learned to stand when it mattered. Clara would add nothing. Her life was the answer. When she finally passed peacefully, with the plains stretching endlessly beyond the window, Eli buried her not between trees, but beneath open sky. No ropes, no witnesses to cruelty. Only wind, grass, and the promise that some endings do not belong to fear. He followed her a year later. The cottonwoods still stand. But now they mark not a place of death, but a reminder that mercy, when chosen, can outlive hatred. The land remembered them long after their names faded from ledgers and headstones. Grass grew thick around the cottonwoods, and birds nested in branches that once bore witness to cruelty. Travelers still paused there, sensing something without knowing why, the air heavy with a past that refused to vanish entirely. Some said the place felt peaceful, others said it felt watchful. Both were right. Years after Eli and Clara were gone, a young woman passed through the plains alone, running from a life that had decided her worth without asking her consent. She stopped near the trees when her horse went lame. As night fell and fear crept in, she noticed the way the wind bent gently through the grass, how the moonlight softened the bark scars instead of sharpening them. She slept there without nightmares, and in the morning she rose feeling strangely steadied, as if the land itself had whispered that survival was possible. The ranch house still stood, weathered but strong. New hands worked it now, descendants of those who once doubted Clara's right to live. They told stories by the fire on cold nights, not of curses, but of a woman who forgave when vengeance would have been easier, and of a man who chose courage over comfort. The stories were never grand. They were simple, almost plain. That was why they endured. The West moved on, as it always did. Railroads cut through open land. Towns grew louder, faster, more certain of their own righteousness. But something essential was lost in that certainty. People forgot how easily fear turns neighbors into executioners, how quickly silence becomes guilt. Only the stories kept that memory alive, passed down in fragments reshaped by time but rooted in truth. Sometimes, when storms rolled in hard from the mountains, lightning would strike close to the cottonwoods without ever touching them. Old ranchers noticed. They said the trees had already seen enough violence for one lifetime. Younger folk laughed it off, but still avoided tying horses there at night. Instinct remembers what history forgets. If Clara's life proved anything, it was that cruelty does not need proof, only permission, and that mercy, once chosen, does not fade with the choosing. It echoes, it settles into the land. It waits for the next broken soul who needs a sign that survival is not shameful. No one sings songs about her. No monuments mark her suffering. And yet the plains are quieter for having known her, less eager to devour the innocent. In a world that often mistakes hardness for strength, her life remains a quiet argument against that lie. Between two trees where death once waited, life learned how to stand a gay moral lesson. Fear can turn ordinary people into instruments of cruelty when they choose judgment over understanding. True strength is not found in condemning the weak, but in protecting them. Compassion has the power to break curses that never truly existed, and mercy, once chosen, can outlive hatred, reshape hearts, and turn places of suffering into symbols of hope.